So, this sermon was almost a country and western song, wherein I listed all the ways in which my father had done me wrong, which wasn't my intent at all. On Saturday night, i.e. last night, at 11:22 p.m., at over 2,000 words, I realized I really hadn't come to the crux of what I truly wanted to say to you all. I realized that I could go on and on and on telling you stories of my life without ever revealing what really mattered. So I decided to take an entirely different approach to this sermon than the one I had started out with. Remember, this is 11:22 p.m. Let me start out by saying that as a pacifist, I feel like a bit of a hypocrite saying how people should and shouldn't celebrate Memorial Day. I feel that the title of the sermon is just all wrong. I mean, it is true that Memorial Day is marketed, as many holidays are in this country, as an excuse to buy things. In this instance, Memorial Day is the unofficial start of summer, and you can find deals on anything from hot dogs and all the fixins to patio equipment to lawnmowers. I find the marketing of the holiday troubling, to be honest. Memorial Day was created to memorialize soldiers who had died while serving their country or who had otherwise passed on. So saying Happy Memorial Day really cheerfully seems a little off, but I am not exactly your Memorial Day poster girl. So why am I doing a service on the day before Memorial Day? Who or what gave me the courage to do a little memorializing? Oddly enough, it was my father. I say oddly enough because I was estranged from him for most of my life. I've never really talked about him, at least willingly. When people ask me about my parents, ask me where they lived, I would say, oh, my mom lives in Denver, and leave it at that. But there is more to the story. You see, my parents were married in Washington, D.C. in 1970, and I was born in Denver in 1972. Feel free to do the math. My father was half Irish, half black, as were both of his parents. Light-skinned with hazel eyes, he could easily pass for white. In fact, the coroner marked his race as white on the death certificate, and I have had the task of correcting that error along with a few other errors. He liked to laugh, a characteristic which heavily influenced my ideas of attractiveness in people. My first crush was on Ernie from Sesame Street. I swear. Because he was so good-natured and because he laughed a lot. My father was a Marine. He enlisted in November of 1959 and was honorably discharged in November of 1965 with a recommendation to re-enlist. He did not. He was born in February 1941 and grew up Irish Catholic in Queens, New York. He was left-handed, but the nuns at his school took care of that little problem. Later on in life, he converted from atheism to Buddhism. My father had a short fuse and, to me, a scary temper. Sometimes he would throw things when he was angry. He once punched a hole in the wall next to the front door. That hole stayed in the wall for years until my mom, tired of waiting for my father to get around to it, patched it up. My mom can also fix a washing machine. She is awesome. His moods and behavior were like night and day. Sometimes he stayed up late for several nights in a row working on one of his projects in the craft room down in the basement. Other times he would sleep through the day, not waking up until the sun was high in the sky. When I was about 6, I was in the furnace room of our old Denver bungalow. Then I found something unexpected. There, propped up against the furnace like it was a broom, was a hunting rifle. I immediately went still. I then backed slowly out of the furnace room and swore never to go in there ever again. I reflected back on that gun every so often as I got older. I wondered why it was there. I wondered if it was loaded. I wondered if the bullets in it would explode if the furnace got too hot. I wondered why it was left out for any curious child, i.e. me, to discover. The question I never really took a look at, though, was the question of ownership. Who did the gun belong to? I kept the discovery of the gun to myself for a very long time. I'm not sure why. I think it is because it didn't seem to fit into the picture I had of my father, for of course, the gun was his. My father was intelligent, but he unfortunately lacked the ability to focus and follow through. I remember him starting and stopping several training courses in lots of different fields, like EMT, in an effort to earn another degree, higher than the one he already had, which was his high school diploma. Our family was a little unconventional, at least by the standards of the time. My mom was the primary breadwinner, for one thing. For another, we watched television during dinner. This may not sound revolutionary to you, but this was during the 70s and early 80s, before Netflix. So I was often multitasking, reading a book while eating dinner while watching television. That's a clue, people, that I'm kind of ADHD. I didn't know that many families had conversations with each other during dinner, with the children answering the father's questions dutifully instead of reading or laughing at the TV. I didn't learn this until I went to my friend Amanda's house for dinner one night, and they sat around the dining room table. I also didn't know how unusual it was for my father to work as a lifeguard at a recreation center as an adult. I only knew that he never wore ties or suits to work, and that he would sometimes let me put the chlorine into the pool after everyone else had gone home for the night. My father was a smoker. He smoked Carlton Greens. Every so often, he would give little me some money and ask me to go to the liquor store around the corner and across the street from the rec center to buy him a pack. I would put the money down on the counter. I was a little short. And say, "Carlton Greens, please." The man behind the counter knew that the 7-year-old in front of him did not smoke menthols. So he would sell the cigarettes to me and give me the change. I would then go back to the rec center with the cash and the cigs. My parents divorced when I was in 5th grade. While I was initially upset, it was actually, I have to admit, kind of a relief. The fight scared me. Lots of things scared me. But once my father moved out, he ceased to be much of a part of my life. He would take me out on Sunday afternoons to go see movies like The Breakfast Club and then have dinner with me, at least until sometime in my high school years when his presence became a little bit more scarce. I eventually learned that I could not rely on my father when I was a junior or senior in high school. In large and in small ways, he let me down and forgot about me. My father was a fan of the books of Louis L'Amour, but he was not much of a letter writer. When I went away to college on the East Coast, my father would write me the occasional letter at first. The letters became fewer and farther between as the years went on. Even during my holiday vacations at home in Denver, I wouldn't see or hear much of him. My father had always had a bad back, as long as I could remember. It was bad enough that it would cause him to miss work on occasion. He ended up losing his job at one recreation center and then at another. He moved from apartment to apartment, depending on what he could afford. The summer before my junior year of college, I received a phone call from him while I was at work. He was being evicted from his apartment, and he needed someone to help him move his belongings. I was just a college kid who drove a VW Bug. I could not help him. I felt totally unable to help him. But I did manage to ask for help from my friend's older brother, who had a truck. My father had nowhere to go, though. He was now homeless. During the winter break of my junior year in 1992, I received a phone call from him. He wanted to meet me at the recreation center near my mom's townhouse. I drove over, nervously hyperventilating, not sure what I would see or learn from him. I had spent the fall semester imagining myself getting phone calls from the Denver police asking me to fly out to Denver to identify his body. But greeting me was a man who cared not a whit that he had caused me such concern over the past semester. He was more excited about qualifying for disability pay and buying a van than he was to see me. At that point, I decided I could no longer invest in him emotionally. The price was too high to pay. That was the last time I saw him in person. After that fateful meeting, he settled into a pattern of calling me during election years. In 1996, he called me a few days before my wedding, waking me up at 4 a.m. Central Time, which was 3 a.m. in Denver, to tell me that he wished he could walk me down the aisle for my wedding, despite the fact that I had not, in fact, invited him to my wedding, not that I would have known where to send the invitation anyway. He called again in 2000. Every time he called, I would find myself severely dysregulated. I was doing fine without a father. Why did he call me? He only seemed to call when it suited him. I lied to him for a while about the existence of my sons, saying I didn't have children. I didn't want him to be a part of their lives, not because I wanted to punish him, but because I wanted them to not have to live with the insecurity of never knowing whether he would be there for them, like I did. Little did I know that there were actual reasons he acted the way he did. Little did I know that he was doing the best he could, given the tools he had. In 2010, I was on the reference desk of the community college library where I worked. The desk phone rang. It was my father. It wasn't even an election year. He was calling me using the cell phone of a friend. Apparently, a nurse in the VA hospital where he was had taken pity on him and taught him how to find me using the internet. He had called the library circulation desk earlier in the week and asked what my desk hours were. I was too upset and too conscious of my surroundings to talk, so I asked for a phone number where I could reach him and arranged to call him back later. The resulting phone call proved to be revelatory, although I didn't really appreciate it at the time. I learned from him that he was originally admitted to the VA hospital for a traumatic brain injury acquired after a fall, but that he had also had his leg amputated due to his type 2 diabetes. I learned that he was dyslexic and had ADHD. I learned that he suffered from paranoia. He mentioned that he had been chased through the streets of Denver by a strange man, a story I then remembered my mom telling me. While this phone call initially angered me, as my father seemed to show no remorse for the way he had forgotten about me throughout the years, I have since realized what a gift it was. When my two boys were diagnosed as having ADHD in their early childhood years, I wasn't entirely surprised. To me, it seemed obvious that they had inherited it from my father. And then, when I figured out that I myself had ADHD during the pandemic, I just took it in stride. My older son has dyslexia, which I now know is tied to my father. And the endless nights and constant sleeping that he engaged in, to me, those seem to indicate that he suffered from bipolar disorder, something I know a little bit about, having successfully battled bipolar disorder type 2 for several years. And I, too, have type 2 diabetes. This was the last phone call I had with him. After that, I would get the occasional call from the VA hospital in Denver trying to reach him. He had apparently given them my phone number as an emergency number, but I never heard from him again. I hate to admit it, but on one level, this was somewhat of a relief. Having him reappear in my life unexpectedly the way he did was traumatic. But over time, I have reflected upon what my father has meant to me. While I didn't want him to be a part of my children's lives, I cannot deny that a part of him lives on in me and in them. My younger son shares his skin tone and eye color. There should be a picture. That's what my father looks like. Handsome devil, right? And when my son was first born, my mom said, he looks famous. He looks like someone I know. Who does he look like? And the whole time I was like, I know exactly who he looks like. My father died in March 2019. I found this out in 2020 after a hunch on my mom's led me to request a death certificate. The many errors on the original death certificate, the fact that they did not list his parents' names, the fact that they got his race wrong, the omission of his military service, have led me on a quest to right these wrongs. During the pandemic, I requested a copy of his military separation papers, and I finally received them this year. With that precious paper in hand, I have been able to correct his death certificate. I am also in the process of ordering a burial flag for him, which I will place in a shadow box frame and hang up in my apartment. I am trying to honor him now that he is gone. I hope that he can now rest easy. I hope that I can rest easy. Blessed be.